Hey, what's going on? My name is Joshua Foust. I'm a freelance journalist and I write about national security, foreign policy, and intelligence issues. Who are we talking with today?
This is Nicholas Mennuti. I'm the author of the upcoming novel Weaponized from Little Brown, which deals in large part in the form of or guise of a thriller with aspects of national security like the NSA, outsourcing, all kinds of things like that.
Cool. So the timing of your book, Nick, I think is really coincidental, maybe is the right word, because this is coming out right when we have all of these like NSA intelligence, electronic spying news stories breaking in the public. So what, I mean, I don't know, what made you want to write about this, like 2 years ago? I don't know what the lead time is for
Oh,
a spy
absolutely.
novel, but I'm assuming it was a while ago.
The contract for it was signed in February of 2011. So, yeah.
Oh, jeez. Okay, so this.
It's funny. I'd been very interested in the sort of the warrantless eavesdropping aspect of things since the first sort of set of leakers came out in, I believe that was probably around like late 2007, correct? Like your people from like Verizon, Russell Tice, that kind of thing during the sort of tail end of the Bush administration.
Yeah.
And I'd written a short story that was published in Agni magazine, which was sort of about a denizen of the NSA who, you know, sort of it got kind of tangled, but it basically was sort of a love story / NSA story, and then I guess I hadn't kind of gotten it out the way I wanted it to, and I hadn't quite finished up with the NSA anyway, so when it came time to write Weaponize, the current book, I had a feeling I was going to kind of go back to it, and you know, all I did basically was just imagine that it had gotten bigger in the interim from, 2007 to, 2011 when I started writing the book, and the sort of size and scope of it, some people thought was a bit paranoid on my part, but, it turned out to be, like, slightly on in a lot of ways.
It did. So, I mean, your book is about this guy who works for the NSA, and he gets, I guess, falsely accused of making some sort of surveillance program or infrastructure, something like that, and then basically goes on the run, and your book follows kind of like the political and law enforcement and media side of it.
Yeah, basically what happens is the protagonist in
I'm saying this having not read it, by the way, just based on like excerpts and things I've kind of.
Yeah, you were kind enough to blast those few excerpts on Medium for me. I really appreciated that. Well, basically in Weaponized, the protagonist Kyle is basically employed by sort of a Booz Allen sort of type of corporation, and pretty much what happens is, and this is still the problem we have, and thankfully this part hasn't come true, is that basically Kyle is accused of finding what's really lacking in the current NSA program, which is a way of filtering all this information. You know, we suck up, as you and I have both written about, we suck up the equivalent to basically the Library of Congress on an almost daily basis, and we don't have the filtering equipment to actually get through most of this, which is why we keep having to build bigger and bigger data centers, because we just keep collecting more and more without the ability to actually go through any of it, or enough of it to be exact. So Kyle is basically in Weaponized is accused of building the sort of apparatus that actually allows that to happen. And the reason he's hounded is not only is the information leaked, but there's also the question of, since this is a private corporation, as in Booz Allen, what are the ramifications for the taxpayer in the sense that was tax money used to build this filtering system? Because if so, then it's illegal. You can't You can't spy on Americans with Americans paying for it, which has actually been my main problem all along with a large part of this.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's even a good segue to kind of talk about the current events tie-in to what's going on right now. I mean, with all of the Edward Snowden revelations and everything else going on with it, you know, we've been learning a lot about how the government collects information on Americans. We haven't been learning a lot about what they do with it. And even in all of the kind of worrying revelations about like the amount they collect, how much they listen to or not listen to, but I guess read emails, read internet traffic, collect phone data, we don't have, I think, a very solid idea of what they're actually doing with the stuff that they supply.
Exactly. That's actually really what I'd like to know. To be perfectly honest, you're right. Is that, you know, no, we don't. The only thing we know is that they just keep building bigger and bigger places to keep it. I'm assuming at some point, you know, somebody's going to get the job of going through some of this, but no, we really don't know. And even in Snowden's revelations, we really don't know what they're doing with a lot of this. You're correct. We just know that they're getting it. Yeah. He hasn't really been able to. You know, and maybe this is in, you know, maybe this is in some of his upcoming leaks or something. What exactly they're doing with all of it, you know?
Yeah, and, you know, I think there are a couple of different threads to pull out of that. One, I mean, I remember many years ago when I was still working for actually a defense contractor for one of the big five companies. And, you know, they had me writing proposals for different kinds of technical contracts that came through. I didn't understand them. I'm not super techie. But they were about doing things like automated analysis of audio files, of video, stuff like that, because at least the one that I was working on was related to the war in Afghanistan. Right. And they were getting so much video from these Predator drones that were flying over the country. I think they were collecting a week's worth of video every 12 hours. That they just didn't have the human resources to be able to go through all of that video and see what was on there, and see if they could actually start figuring out how to prioritize what they pay attention to. I mean, I know that there's a lot of research into kind of visual behavioral analysis when it comes to video stuff. So seeing if there's certain telltale markers that can be singled out and then highlighted so that a human can then go through a more thorough review process.
Right.
And I mean, I'm assuming there's something like that for audio as well, but there's so much, I think by design and in a way by necessity, so much opacity about how all of that stuff functions and what it ultimately gets used for. And the best that we're ever able to get out are these kind of like vague, random
exactly.
hints.
Like, you know, that's
like just today, McClatchy published a story out of Beirut saying that the CIA had warned the Lebanese government about an impending al-Qaeda attack in southern Lebanon, which is a Hezbollah stronghold. And it was being framed as the CIA is helping Hezbollah avoid an attack. The other side of it, though, is that the CIA was also helping a friendly government avoid a civilian massacre. And it happened to help Hezbollah, but it also happened to counter al-Qaeda. And it also happened to be a step towards preventing al-Qaeda from exporting the Syrian civil war into Lebanon, which would be a horrible thing. So, I mean, like, to me, a story like that really highlighted one of the challenges in all of this, which is that the ways this sort of intelligence can get used can not only just be used for like good for preventing a massacre, like a massive civilian bomb in a city, but also it gets wrapped up in really complicated political issues as well, geopolitical issues.
There's a tremendous
of having to order like friends and enemies and figure out which one you want to help and which one you want to hurt.
There's a tremendous amount of moral ambiguity when you have all that information at your fingertips. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know the thing about collecting and harnessing information is that, and I hope this isn't the impression I've given, it's not all bad. You know, once again, it is a degree of moral ambiguity because let's be honest, the current conflict that we're in, if we can call it a conflict, that I don't know, but the current sort of worldwide geopolitical situation that we find ourselves in is not in any way akin to what we experienced, you know, in the Cold War, things like that. In that the conventional methods of spying are useless. They really don't have this. You know, it's not about passing notes to. It's not about, you know, blue bloods passing notes to atomic scientists at an embassy party anymore. You know, it's about.
Except that that it kind of is on occasion. I mean, that's how we've learned a lot about like Iran's nuclear program, for example.
Yeah, and I think what I was saying, I think signals intelligence is really one of the only options we have in a war of this sort where we don't have a really embedded. We don't really have an embedded spying program the way we used to in places like Russia or Berlin or things like that during the Cold War. It's a diffuse conflict, and as you know, as a geopolitical reporter, you know it's also worldwide. You know, there's not one country that's a fulcrum of problems anymore. You know, so.
Although, in fairness, the Cold War was also a worldwide struggle. I seem to recall Cold War conflicts happening from Southeast Asia to Latin America, with Africa in between. So, I mean, it's not like in the Cold War our troubles or our intelligence activities were restricted to one country. But, I mean, I think you're raising something interesting about human intelligence. I've been a pretty vocal proponent of ditching a lot of the signal stuff and going back towards a more human-heavy approach. But there are a lot of challenges to that. One of the big ones, like you said, is that these are diffuse organizations, so they're really hard to penetrate. And I think what a lot of policymakers have done is decided that signals intelligence or electronic surveillance or ELINT, whatever you want to call it, is a good way of kind of getting around that fundamental like geographic challenge. The other one, though, is that it's legal for, I mean, it sounds weird to talk about it in these terms, but it's legal for the CIA to send spies into another country to collect on them. So it's legal for the CIA to try to implant someone in, or to have implanted someone in the KGB. It's legal for the CIA to try to cultivate sources within the Chinese government. It's not necessarily legal for them to have one of their agents commit terrorism to join Al-Qaeda to collect information on them.
Yeah.
Because we've passed really restrictive laws about what our spies and you know, a lot of people who criticize the intelligence community don't really like grappling with this, but there are fairly restrictive laws on what our spies are legally permitted to do in the course of gathering intelligence.
Absolutely.
One thing they can't do is commit terrorism. And if you have to commit terrorism to get into the inner circle of a terrorist organization, that's a huge limitation on our part in terms of being able to actually develop human assets. So while agreeing with you that this is why signals intelligence is as prominent as it is in the collection process, I think there's also a little bit of like a gadget love where the government loves its gonkulators and they just love these big computers with blinking lights that can give them answers without putting
I agree with you. I don't
but
think,
there's also a really significant legal challenge, I think, to developing deeper human intelligence assets in a lot of these organizations.
I don't think necessarily the switch from human intelligence to signals intelligence is a good thing for spying. I just think, as you pointed out, that you know it's looked at as an expeditious thing in the current climate. It would. You also have to, and as you know from reporting on the CIA, one of the biggest problems we have, both in terms of the harvested signals intelligence and human intelligence, is a language barrier. You know, that's another thing nobody talks about. It's half the reason we're having trouble both implanting human intelligence and going through all of our signals intelligence is you got to have somebody who can understand this stuff, and we don't have that either. You know, so. That's another barrier. And going back to what you were saying about, you know, the Cold War and proxy wars and, you know, all over, you're absolutely right. The only benefit to those from the government's point of view was they were, in a sense, on the ground, battle and contained. You know, you could refer to Vietnam as a specific field of battle. You know, you could refer to, you know, Angola as a specific field of battle. There really isn't a specific field of battle anymore, and this gets into the whole notion of something that, you know, we probably don't even have time to get into, but something that happened in basically World War I, which was the obliteration during warfare, civilians and soldiers. And that's really, I think, the story of the 20th century, is how basically everybody became a target, you know, in these massive wars.
Well, and not only that, I mean, I can't believe I'm even referencing this. I remember having to read The Debacle by Emile Zola in college. So, you know, the Franco-Prussian War. And one of the interesting things, at least in that story, is that as the Prussians were sweeping into eastern France, they would mostly leave the civilians alone unless the civilians picked up a gun, and then the Prussians would shoot them on sight. And there wasn't this sense that civilians were, there was a sense that civilians were protected class. I don't think they thought about it that way. They just thought they're just civilians. They're not our problem. They're not our enemy. But the moment a civilian picked up a weapon, they were killed. In theory now, at least in various forms of international law, that still exists. If a civilian decides to engage in militancy, it can be targeted. Except that in places where civilians routinely engage in violence, attacking them, treating them as militants when they're behaving like militants is still considered unacceptable. And I think this gets at something that you're kind of getting to, is that not just that conflicts like Vietnam were bounded geographically. Also, deniable wars were much more deniable. I think in a way, the CIA campaign in Afghanistan in the 80s was more of a harbinger than it was this kind of like weird, unique event that people thought it was at the time, where they were kind of openly aiding the enemy of the Soviet Union without also openly aiding them, if that makes sense. It was all technically covert, all technically secret, but everyone knew what was going on.
And it worked so,
That's the case
and it worked so
now
well.
More than
yeah, and it worked
before.
so well, it laid the groundwork for Iran-Contra, of course.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, and I think what's so interesting is that over time, over the last several decades, you've seen this shift of covert programs, covert violence being not only deniable, which is why they're covert in the first place, but also not secret anymore either. And I don't know if I'm explaining this right. So when something is just clandestine, that means it's supposed to be secret. The military does clandestine things all the time. The CIA does. NSA does. Everyone does clandestine things. When things are covert, that's a separate category where it's not only secret, it's supposed to be done in such a way that the government can't be conclusively linked to it. But some of the most, I guess, controversial covert programs of the last probably decade, things like drone strikes in Pakistan, that assassination campaign against nuclear scientists in Iran. I'm sure there are other things I'm just not thinking of off the top of my head. They are technically covert, but they're not clandestine by any sense because everyone knows who's doing it. And it's reported on really widely with documentary
and the thing
evidence.
What we're talking about now is a switch from those two things you brought up, and they're excellent examples that I would bring up as well. Covert policy has moved, in a sense, from being a literal covert policy to a warning, in a way. It's moved from... Yeah.
And it's also moved from being a description of the visibility of a program to a description of how the government is trying to insulate itself legally. And I think that's a really interesting evolution as well, in that it's, President Obama talks about drone strikes on TV. He's careful not to say the word Pakistan, but everyone knows he's talking about Pakistan. But he never actually admits that there's a program going on in Pakistan, and you will never see a U.S. official admitting that there is a drone program going on in Pakistan, because technically it's covert, meaning the government's involvement in it is secret, which is also supposed to insulate them from any kind of legal challenges, which has been successfully employed by the government when they've been sued over drone strikes in Pakistan. But I mean, to me, that's a remarkable change in that it's not only just rumors that the CIA is doing something really nasty. There's evidence. There's documentary evidence the CIA is doing this. Yeah. But because it's covert, they don't actually admit to it, and so therefore they're not held accountable for anything that happens.
It's sort of like the old axiom about the coquettishness of French women, which is, come here, but don't come here. It's that it's that kind of thing. It's
From now on, I'm going to refer to the CIA as a coquettish.
Yeah, you can take that
and just see what they say.
Take that one. It's all yours.
Wow. Okay.
The thing, and I'm sure you saw it this morning. In the papers is that or online is that somebody nominated Snowden for a Nobel Peace Prize? Did you see this?
Yeah, I mean, but who cares? Lots of people get nominated for prizes. Like Nursultan Nazarbayev, the dictator of Kazakhstan, got nominated for a peace prize.
Yeah, I think you and I are only 2 years away. It's like a Golden Globe. We're really you and I may be like just 2 years away from getting one. But no, I just think
it's like The Simpsons when Homer forms the barbershop quartet and gets a Grammy. And he throws it out the window, and someone's like, "Oh my God, this is an award!" And they pick it up and they go, "Oh, it's just a Grammy," and throw it in a garbage can. Walk on.
It's true. Yeah, it's just like it's like to me, and I mean, to me, it's like when they nominated Obama for the Nobel Peace Prize. It's like for basically elevating political discourse. I was sort of.
For not being George W. Bush.
Exactly. And it's like so basically, and the thing that's so infuriating about.
Joke's on them.
Oh, yeah, no kidding. Whoops. But the thing about the Snowden thing that's interesting to me is that, like, I don't know, like, the whole point of the NSA is to spy on Europe, and they expected this. So how can the level of European outrage over this, to me, has been almost farcical.
Oh, it's totally hypocritical.
You know, I mean, I just couldn't stop. I mean, look, as an American, I think we have a right to ask questions about what's being done in our country. But the whole purpose of the NSA and the CIA is to monitor foreign locations. And you can't tell me that, you know, Germany and France, they may not have as advanced a system as us, but they are doing what we're doing, you know.
They do, and something I actually found interesting, in particular about François Hollande's response to all of this, is that France is kind of renowned for being one of the world's most intrusive spying countries. On an industrial espionage level, Germany thinks France's industrial spying is worse than China's. And China is usually lifted up as kind of like the global bad guy of industrial spying, but France is far worse. I'm not always comfortable referencing them, but actually the WikiLeaks cable database has a lot of examples of the U.S. trying to protect U.S. companies and then also warning other European countries about France's like pervasive spying.
There's a whole,
and their head of internal intelligence just got indicted for wiretapping a bunch of journalists at Le Monde, which is one of the biggest newspapers in Paris. To try to get around, to try to investigate where the source of a government leak came from. So for France to complain about the U.S. spying industry spying on France is enormous. Like, it's an enormous act of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very French.
It's very French. But
yes,
it's.
But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of this. What, me spy? No, we're evolved. I mean, it's nonsense.
Well, one of the things that I remember, this is one of the big sort of industrial espionage things, and you know, somebody I'm sure will fact check me on this, but there was one of the first cases during the Clinton presidency of sort of getting involved in industrial espionage was really the French were messing around with a Boeing deal, I believe. So they've been at this. Yeah. They've been at this way. I mean, the Chinese in a way are actually they're just not as subtle at it. You know, they just tend to take people hostage when a negotiation isn't going as well as they had hoped. The French are a bit more, you know, sort of covert about it.
Yeah, and the Chinese don't cover their tracks as well too. I mean, like we've found, I think, backdoors built into motherboard chips manufactured in China that's caused a lot of worry, but. It's been nothing on the level of subtlety as when in the early 90s we were buying ejection seats from France and they came with like really sophisticated passive listening devices built into them. I mean, like it's just a different level of brazenness where with the US and China even you expect there to be a certain amount of it and you just kind of control for it and move on. But for a country like France to engage in the degree, depth, and aggressiveness of espionage that they do, and to then bitch and moan when the U.S. just gets exposed to be doing the exact same thing back to them. I think that's just a remarkable kind of act of double talk.
Oh, absolutely. And it gives them a chance to... I mean, one of the things Europe really loves to do, and I think this probably, you know, has a lot to do with the way World War II worked out, is they just love it when they can get the high ground. And occasionally it gets, you know, sort of... And I think as more of the... as sort of more of the Snowden stuff comes out, possibly they'll be able to less and less make this sort of egregious attempt to occupy the moral high ground. Because they've been doing it, you know. I mean, let's be honest, we learned spying from Europe, you know. We did. From the UK. The United States didn't have a CIA until post-World War II. Everything we know about spying, we learned from them. So... You know, it's sort of, you know, like you're kind of slapping us on the wrist for getting better at this than the teacher, you know. So,
so okay, you brought up Snowden, and I think we have to talk about this because again, there's a novel tie-in. So in your novel, your character basically is on the run. There's like a worldwide media hunt for this guy while he's wanted by the feds. That's also true of Edward Snowden. Where he's hiding out in Russia's airport, totally without giving them anything, Like, yeah, like the Russians are totally not spying on him right now. But he's hiding out in Russia's airport, and he's trying to escape to Latin America, I guess, as you do when you're a felon. So how does this end? What happens to a wanted spy or a wanted espionage leaker type who is currently insulated from U.S. reprisal but faces enormous danger the moment he tries to leave?
Right. Well, the first thing my co-writer David Guggenheim and I, the first thing we did when we were looking at Weaponized was, all right, where are we going to set this? And it was funny. We were thinking of Thailand in the beginning, and then they extradited Victor Boot like 2 days after we came up with that idea, so that one had to go out the window. And we were trying to. The first mistake Snowden made, in my opinion, was he shouldn't have leaked from China. Do you know what I mean? Like he should have gotten himself to either a Venezuela or an Ecuador or, basically any country that has either a non-extradition policy or would be difficult for the U.S. to leverage. And that's why basically when we were looking at this, we went with Cambodia and Weaponized because really, one, they do have a non-extradition policy, and two, there are other fugitives there. So it made sense. So that in one way, in Weaponized, is why our character is actually a lot more secure in that he's off the grid more effectively than Snowden. In terms of getting back, I mean, that is really the whole plot of Weaponized and why he ends up embroiled in this scenario, because his way out is really to exchange passports, a la strangers on a train, but with passports, with another American who has some of his own problems, but whose passport can get him out of Cambodia. And that's where sort of all the mayhem ensues, because he's been clearly taken advantage of and played. So Snowden's in a rough spot, because I don't know how he gets out. I don't know how he gets out of that airport. I mean, if they're willing to bring down the Bolivian jet to look for him, he's going to have a hard time unless they've got some of those leftover World War II tunnels under Russia, that can get him somewhere.
I'm sure those exist. Like, that's not something that...
No, I mean, Ian McEwan had a good book about those.
Well, but, I mean, I think it's kind of an interesting question to ponder. He's, I guess, been granted asylum in Venezuela.
I think Ecuador is agreed to it in theory as well. Yeah.
And I guess Nicaragua as well, but... yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how he... So while we're talking about stupid moves, you said it was dumb of him to leak documents from China. I think also whoever advised him to leave Hong Kong and go to Russia without a passport also gave him really, really
Absolutely.
bad
I expect
advice.
more from the WikiLeaks people than that,
Yeah, like they should be more sophisticated than that. Then again, WikiLeaks, which is opposed to government surveillance, hired as their senior, legal director, a Spanish judge who got disbarred for illegally wiretapping attorneys during a corruption trial. So, I mean, I'm not sure they're they're exercising the best judgment all the time in the friends that they choose. But, yeah, I mean, it was really dumb advice to go to Russia if you don't have a legal means.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, it's funny.
Because normally with Russia, if you show up and you don't have a visa or you forgot your passport or something, they put you on the next plane back to wherever you came from, and they just say, get out of the country.
Yeah. Well,
Snowden doesn't want to do that. And Russia's actually being very indulgent by letting him stay in Sheremetyevo as long as they have. But... where do you go if you can't legally leave?
It brings up an interesting issue, that you brought up in one of your posts, and it's one that I don't want to get into too much because it'll make us both sound vaguely conspiratorial in a way that we don't want to be. But what I think is fascinating is so Snowden was, although clearly gifted with computers, was a high school dropout. And managed to get into Booz Allen and assume a position where he had this level of top secret clearance. Now, you and I both know they hand out top secret clearance these days, basically like Tic Tacs. But that being said,
Yeah.
That's odd to me. Then, the WikiLeaks memo that came out purportedly written by Snowden that had the most stilted English I've heard since, Borat attempted to give a speech. And then on top of which, him going to Russia from China, I mean, it all stems to it all just seems like he's being either really badly advised or there's somebody behind the curtain here who's not doing a very good job. I don't know. I feel like Edward Snowden is not in control of his own destiny, is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I feel like
he's not at this point. And one of the problems with how he decided to kind of play his public image is that the leverage he had was to basically try to graymail the federal government. Graymailing is when you try to hold a government hostage with the threat of revealing some sort of top secret or sensitive data should something bad happen to you. His strategy, I think, clearly was to try to graymail Washington, and he's been doing that through Glenn Greenwald. But it's not working, and I think I shouldn't say Snowden is probably starting to really panic and be like, wait a minute, this isn't working out the way I thought it would. I thought I'd be able to travel freely if I could threaten to just expose this stuff if they messed around with me. The other side of that is that by bragging that you have, I think the latest one was the blueprints to how the intelligence community is built. Neither Russia nor China are going to let you escape with your data intact if you brag about having that while you're in their territory.
No, it's true.
It may be encrypted. They may be throwing their biggest computers to break the encryption if they can't figure it out from listening in on your conversations. But they have that. So it's out of his hands. As soon as he announced that he had it, he lost all of his leverage because he would be compromised. I mean, there's a lot of pushback on that of saying, oh, you don't know, there's no evidence. It's true. We don't have evidence because Russia and China don't brag about their intelligence victories the way we do. But it would be really, really stupidly naive to pretend that countries as technologically sophisticated as Russia and China, and when it comes to internet and computer security, they are enormously sophisticated. I'd say the least on par with us. In Russia's case, possibly better than us. At computer security, that countries that sophisticated wouldn't know how to get
here's the other
question
we have to ask ourselves, and this is I know I'm not bringing up somebody who's your favorite person anyway, so I don't have much hesitation in doing it, but I feel like Greenwald has put to some extent Snowden at a degree of risk for his own career that is unconscionable, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, and Greenwald's been playing this weird kind of hybrid journalist, spokesman, defense attorney role for Snowden anyways, which I found really kind of fascinating in its own right. But also by using Snowden to kind of push his own antagonism of the U.S. government out into the public, I don't think he's fully realized how much that ends up hurting Snowden himself, and in a way almost delegitimizing the cause that he's trying to push. Greenwald may not care because he said that he has all of these documents. He's going to continue leaking them regardless. And in a way, I think he's kind of using this guy to accomplish his own
Snowden's
agenda.
he's basically using Snowden as a very big
that's his right
stick,
to do. Yeah. So, at the end of the day, I'm honestly really curious how Snowden is going to try to get out of this. I'm actually out of ideas for how he can get out of this without winding up in a U.S. cell.
When you finish reading Weaponized, it's been printed, so I can actually get you an official copy now, as opposed to just streaming my excerpts. What I was going to say, you'll learn how you might potentially get out of a situation like this, and it's not pleasant. So I don't think anything. I don't think there's much fun. Let's just put it this way: Edward is not going to end up in a place with a spectacular climate anytime soon. You know what I mean?
Fair enough. All right, cool. I think we're actually.
We did our third. Yeah.
On that sunny, pleasant note. So, Nick, thanks for chatting. It was enjoyable to kind of bat around some ideas.
Absolutely, yeah, no, and I've been reading your work for a while, and I liked your point of view and where you're coming from. I thought it would be fun to have a chat, and I'm really glad you were up for it. Thank you.
Cool.